Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Fusion 21 Members Forum, which, again, as you all know, you were supposed to be joining us in Manchester, but due to the coronavirus, two things, obviously, we had to cancel. But again, thank you all very much for joining, and hope you are all well. And not in too much turmoil in terms of the current situation. We are, I am Andrew Gray, Member Relations Manager at Fusion21, and again, welcome you to this future of procurement. How do we learn the lessons, and how do we future-proof our approach? The panel, unfortunately, has also been slightly decimated and changed as a result of coronavirus. But with us today, we have Katie Saunders, partner at Trowers and Hamlins. Morning, Katie.
Hey, everyone.
And Nick Verburg, who's the Procurement and Supply Chain Manager at Fusion21. So welcome, Nick.
Yeah, good morning, Andrew. Good morning, everybody.
Okay, just one little aside, and it's all to do with the way in which our technology works this end. You may, as we're speaking on the screen, see both Nick's name come up twice, so don't be confused. Hopefully by the end of this you'll get used to who's speaking. The panel, we had hoped that Emma Highland, Procurement Manager at Salex Homes, and Barry Goodwin, Procurement Team Lead at Kirklees, were going to be able to join us, but unfortunately, for a variety of different reasons, but all linked to the same issue, they aren't able to come and join us. But hopefully, we'll get a real good debate and some comments from both Katie and Nick. The questions that we're going to go through, and we'll go through them each in turn. For those who are attending and involved in this webinar for the first time, you should see on your screen a box, and in that box there is an area in which you can type your questions and comments. So we do really encourage you to ask your questions, and I will then relay them to the panel and comment as we go along. So please do add any questions or in particular comments. So again, within your organisation, you are dealing with these procurement challenges, and we do really want to hear your views, your comments, your questions. So let's start at the beginning. So I'll start with you, Katie. Obviously, we're now in the sort of post-Hackett. We're still going through the Grenfell inquiry, but clearly a lot has happened. There are some clear recommendations in terms of what Hackett has said and their impact on procurement teams. I think above all, one of the issues around how we as a sector avoid the race to the bottom, and it'd be really interesting to understand this from your perspective.
Okay, that's a good question to start with, and good morning, everyone. I think where we see the Hackett recommendation taking us was very much into the Building a Safer Future legislation, which obviously was published as a consultation document in sort of the early autumn, also in July, with the consultation closing over the summer. And I think from a procurement point of view, one of the key issues, which was interesting to note, was there wasn't much that transferred from the Hackett recommendations about procurement into the Building a Safer Future legislation. And in fact, it was notable by its omission. And that, as procurement professionals, as I feel, is a lost opportunity. We did question this with Cabinet Office and MHCLG at the time, and it was explained that actually they feel that procurement practice needs to be changed through guidance, rather than legislation. But subsequent to that, they obviously are looking at changes to the procurement regs in the context of Brexit, which I know we're going to discuss later. So we may see some changes coming forward. So the Hackett recommendations, very much as you put on the slide, Andrew, were to... Oh, we've got some a bit of interference there. Apologies, that was not my end. But the recommendations were to avoid a race to the bottom. And, the whole idea of imposing during your procurement processes the actual evaluation of the quality that you want and assessing your bidders on the basis of quality and not getting a bias in respect of price, if that is not your intention. And I'm sure Nick has comments about this as well, but it's been fairly sort of well discussed in training sessions and best procurement practice that despite best efforts of procurement professionals, you often do get a skewing towards lowest price, regardless of how you're trying to structure your procurement. So that, I think, is still live. It is still something that framework providers, that public sector clients are grappling with, that they can't get away from the fact that often the price evaluation will skew the result, despite their best efforts, and particularly in the current climate where contractors, suppliers and service providers are keen to win contracts, then there is often that very grey area of a very low bid, which may or may not be an abnormally low bid, but just changes the whole dynamic of the procurement process. So I do think it is still something we're grappling from, and that was one of the key recommendations of Hackett. And I don't know whether Nick would like to comment on that from the perspective of how you can structure the frameworks and the competitions that run the frameworks to avoid that race to the bottom.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Katie. I think one of the main challenges in general terms is moving forward, having the agility within procurement teams to firstly be able, but also be willing to actually adapt to change. I think public procurement has historically been quite a risk-averse industry, and at least that's what the research says. But as we move forward to implement recommendations from the Hackett report, those procurement strategies will definitely now need to adapt. And I think that need for agility is perhaps highlighted even further given the challenges that we're facing in the world today. Specifically in terms of the race to the bottom, I think can definitely be mitigated by the strength of those procurement strategies. And Katie, I absolutely get what you're saying in terms of sort of looking at that price quality split. For me, it's not as simple as that, as saying, well, we will provide more of a weighting towards quality than we will to price, because it is quite easy to say that. But for me, it's how that is then, how those commercial models are actually structured, ensuring people with the right expertise establish those commercial models that are relevant to the works, that consider whole life costs, but also then taking that a step further to think about how they're then evaluated to ensure that, as you mentioned, those costs are sustainable. Because if those costs aren't sustainable, generally there are two outcomes on the back of that. First of all, the work isn't done properly, and that has a whole host of ramifications, obviously, that we've unfortunately seen over the last few years. And secondly, that those costs will likely be recovered somewhere else through that contract delivery as well. So I think revisiting those procurement strategies and getting everything right from the start to finish is going to be crucial to avoid that race to the bottom.
Just in terms of, I know that, as I said at the beginning, Emma Emma Halen from Salex couldn't join us, but she has sort of sent me through some of the things that Salex are doing. And one of the issues that she is around the training of her procurement staff to and a complete sort of review of value for money and how they evaluate tenders. Again, from a Fusion21 perspective, Nick, has there been changes in the way frameworks are procured directly as a result of the Hackett recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, we're starting to implement changes again in how close we are to some of those commercial models. As I say, I think Salix Homes are right in terms of the development in staff and giving people with the right expertise, the skills that they need to make sure that the procurement strategies are right, that evaluation criteria is right, that award criteria is right. There's a number of different things that need to change generally across industries in public procurement, and that is how we can create more competition, how we can create more opportunities for SMEs to deliver in public procurement and supporting that government agenda. Because if we can do that, and if we can get the evaluation criteria right, if we can get the award criteria right, whilst creating more competition across supply chains, then that is a way of avoiding potentially that race to the bottom, because naturally you're creating more competition through that process. So specifically for us at Fusion21, we have taken some positive actions to look at our end-to-end procurement process to try and create more competition and avoid what can quite easily become a competition within public procurement as to who can potentially write some of the largest essay responses and how you then evaluate some of that subjectivity. So we're trying to strip some of the detail back to make it a bit more of an evidence-based process, but also then underpinned by a cost structure that is right and can be applied across the works or services, or the relevant works and services.
Okay.
One thing that I think just that Hackett did recommend is the sort of the early engagement with the supply chain, and I think one of the way the Cabinet Office is looking at potentially changing the procurement regs or strengthening or streamlining them is to emphasise what you have within the procurement regime to already as tools to enable you to do that early engagement. And I think one of the issues that we find is that there isn't enough time for clients to do an early engagement with the supply chain before they're into a full-blown procurement process. And that's a real missed opportunity, because there is scope within the procurement regulations to engage with soft market testing, to understand what you're procuring, get a feel for the right price before you even go out to the market. And again, that's something, giving the procurement professionals the time, the skills to be able to do that, and getting public sector, senior management teams and executive teams to understand that they need to not just dump on their procurement team the requirement to go and get a supply chain for whatever they're procuring, on the drop of a hat. So I think that forward planning, particularly when we're looking at some of the other questions about how we're going to plan for the future, zero carbon and a sort of long-term strategy, all those need to be taken into consideration, really planning your procurement process early, making sure you've gone to the market, you've talked to the market, you understand what they can offer, so therefore you can structure your procurement and your price and quality evaluation in the right way. And also building evaluation of things like life cycle costing, which again is something else that Hackett recommended. And not enough is being done on that, because I think we all struggle to know what are the questions to ask and whether we've got the data available in the market to answer them. So the more you talk to the market, the more you're going to understand exactly what they can offer as long-term solutions for, particularly in housing, schools, education programs, to have a long-lasting sort of mature product that is going to be sustainable and energy efficient, and all the things that we want to achieve in building our homes and our buildings for the future.
Okay, that's excellent. So again, just a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions or comments, please do use the question panel, and on your screen type out your question, and we'll relay that to the panel. But moving on, so perhaps some of us never thought it was going to happen, or nailing colours to the mast, hoped it would never happen, but we have now left the EU and so on, and therefore, what do you believe that means as far as public sector procurement is concerned? Though we may have added to this, what the heck does the coronavirus do to public sector procurement? But we'll ignore that for the minute. So Nick, from your perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So the crux of it for me at this point is that ultimately there will still be a requirement for competition and transparency in how we spend public money, and that is absolutely correct, as well as ensuring that we're creating opportunity and fair opportunity across our supply chain. So the treaty principles that currently underpin public procurement will still apply, and as Katie mentioned, there is a task force that has been established to look at the future of public procurement. I mean, I don't personally envisage a drastic reform of that, and neither do I feel that it'll be right at the very top of the reform agenda in terms of how quickly any changes might take place. But I do sense a shift in potentially how we operate in public procurement, to not just focus on the procurement activity itself, but perhaps providing more of a focus on supply chain management moving forward. And I think this whole Brexit journey so far has presented a number of challenges in terms of the stability of the economy, how this then affects supply chains, how this is then affecting costs in the future, the potential access to skills and the access to labour. And for me, one way to effectively manage some of these challenges is how we can actually work with our supply chain and the relationships that we have with our suppliers, and understanding the market from the view of the supplier. And that, I guess, picks up on Katie's previous point around getting the supply chain involved right from the very outset of determining whether it's an asset management strategy or whether it's the procurement strategy, to make sure that that knowledge and that resource within the supply chain, of which there is a lot of, is tapped into.
Katie?
Yeah, I think we've been fortunate to be privy to some of the early conversations with Cabinet Office about the proposed changes to procurement regulations, and I think we were fairly sceptical as to how far up the agenda procurement regulations would be post-Brexit. So it was refreshing to be called to a meeting early in this year to actually talk to Cabinet Office about what their views are of how they can improve the current regulations. As Mick says, they're not going away. But certainly, I think that the UK government really wants to have proper process for procurement, and that the procurement regulations as they stand are not broken, but they could do better. So the things that they were looking at were four issues: simplification, flexibility, being able to build an innovation, and as Nick just said, getting more SMEs involved. And that point about the public sector not using the regulations to their full potential, so more training and guidance and policy sort of best practice coming out of Cabinet Office to upskill people in procurement. But I think they've been questioning whether we do need all the different procedures. So the number of those: open procedure, the sort of negotiated procedure, the standard restricted procedure. I think they're looking at sort of streamline to three processes: the open, a direct award with transparent reasons, and then a selected procedure. So that would be interesting, and I think would be really helpful if we could look at those as a sort of, and particularly the direct award with transparent reasons. Looking at standardizing selection questionnaires, we've already got to that point a few years ago, but whether that actually helps SMEs, I think it's been one of those unintended consequences, that it's actually been more of a burden for SMEs than not. And then one of the big things that came out of that discussion was having a procurement regulator stroke tribunal who would then sort of monitor practice and also consider issues where public sectors have not followed the rules. So I think we are looking at some changes coming forward, which is great to see. As you say, what's going on across the country and the world at the moment may slow things down, but it's certainly on the agenda for changes post-Brexit, which is interesting. I think if we can simplify some of the issues that we find we struggle with, and have some more sort of much more direct engagement with a regulator, rather than looking at the reference to the European Court of Justice, that would be helpful as well. And also just a clearer understanding about that sort of direct award process, because most of the time as lawyers, procurement lawyers, we are asked to try and find a way in order for a client to be able to award directly to someone they feel is the right person for the job. And at the moment there isn't that accessibility except through established frameworks, and even then it is difficult to run a direct award process without putting yourself in danger of a challenge.
Yeah, there's a couple of things for me in that as well, Katie, in terms of some of the changes. I think simplification is good. It'll be interesting to see what happens with some of the new procedures and how they can be used. Also, in terms of the tribunal and establishing the tribunal and the format that will take, because part of my concern is
if we are creating some new procedures but aiming to simplify them, we still need skills, we need ability with individuals and with procurement professionals across the public sector to have the confidence and the desire to implement them, but implement them in the best possible way. And I wonder whether, depending on the structure of the tribunal format and how easy it is for challenge, and there should be a process for challenge, of course, there should be, it should work that way, but I would be concerned about how, if that's not done properly, how that then has an impact back on risk appetite and skills and experience, and ultimately that appetite to try and be more commercially savvy and take some calculated risks. So it will be very interesting to see.
Okay, excellent. So moving on then to our next topic, where we've asked about how do you work with suppliers to improve relations and prioritize qualities, and both of you in terms of your earlier answers have sort of alluded to all of this, and one of the sort of questions that we've had is around, you know, what does early engagement with suppliers look like, and you know, do we have any sort of best practice examples of what that might look like? So if you like, Katie, from sort of your perspective and the work that you do, you know, do you have a view?
I think it's important, as I said before, to understand that it is permitted under the current regulatory framework. So regulations 40 and 41 allow preliminary market consultations, and you can actually, under regulation 41, involve candidates or tenderers, provided they declare their actual interest when the tender documents come out. So I think that there has been a fear in the past that you cannot go and talk to the market because you'll be hit with a challenge that you have preferred a particular supplier. But actually, if you are transparent about who you're talking to, even if that consultant or contractor or supplier has actually helped form the procurement process, and you're transparent about their involvement, you can actually engage with the market early. So that, I think, is really helpful. Where we've seen it working well in practice is particularly around technology. Obviously, one of the big issues for public sector, certainly in the RP sector, is the need to, you know, look at their data, how they can improve, how they manage their data internally and externally, and go into the IT market, which is a pretty aggressive market, and they are small fry compared to some of the big IT providers. This is, you know, that has been really helpful. They need to engage early with those providers to understand what they can offer and what solutions they can offer for particularly their housing management, for their all their sort of you know, all their asset management as well. So I think that's been really helpful to be able to engage with those providers at an early stage to understand how they can shape their procurement and understand the technologies available. Because often in the past we've seen clients just go out to the market on a wing and a prayer and hope that the market can deliver what they want. And I remember working on a procurement process, a practice for they called it a unified communication system for a client. This must be going back 5 or 6, maybe 7 years ago now. But of course, a unified sort of communication system did not exist in the market. But because they thought if they asked, they would get the right answer. Yes, of course, we'll deliver that for you. So really important, I think, from a technology perspective, to engage with the market as to what they can deliver before you go out and run a formal procurement. And the other point, before I hand over to Nick, is the appetite. We obviously, in particular in the construction sector, there is a stretch on resource, on skills. So many developers and contractors are pulling back from open and competitive tender processes on the if they just cannot resource them, and actually they haven't got the ability to deliver those projects. So they're picking and choosing what they bid for. So again, that naivety of sometimes that the client thinking that if they go to the market that they will get a response. That has sometimes, you know, there's been a lot of hard work, but very little response coming back from the market. So again, early engagement is essential.
Okay, Nick.
Yeah, Yeah, so I mean, personally, I'm a big advocate in general terms of early market engagement and actually making best use of the potential that does exist in the regs in this particular space. And over the last few years, we did start to see a slight drop in terms of competition through an interest in some of our procurement activity, and we knew that we needed to start making positive steps in terms of how we can build that interest across supply markets. And we started to look at different areas in terms of that engagement. So surveys, meet the buyer events, one-to-one conversations, the way that we advertise, the process for engagement, how we can use construction line to tap into certain markets are all ways that we've started to really build engagement across all of our supply chains. And at Fusion21, we've got over 400 suppliers across our procurement frameworks. And one of the biggest shifts for me over the last couple of years has been recognizing the contributions that those suppliers do have within our industry, and perhaps a change of mindset from a buyer perspective, because we now recognize that it's not just about how suppliers are competing for our business and for our members' business and a place on our frameworks. It's actually us competing for those suppliers and competing for them up front. And going back to your first question, Andrew, in terms of quality and avoiding the race to the bottom, if we want to prioritize quality in the delivery of our works and services, then we need to make sure that our frameworks are full of the best suppliers that exist within those markets. And for us to do that, there's probably two things to summarize. Firstly, as we've said, engaging with the supply chain from the very outset of procurement strategy and getting them involved in shaping that service, which ultimately is giving them some ownership within that, which is crucial. And then secondly, letting them help shape the procurement process itself and avoiding, as I mentioned earlier, that procurement competition that's favoured towards maybe large teams of bid writers who are used to providing essay-type responses that can be quite subjective, and then from a buyer evaluator side, it's difficult to break some of that down. So instead, actually levelling the playing field and providing those SME opportunities in procurement, because ultimately, the greater level of procurement, the greater the opportunity is there to deliver good quality services through those contracts.
Just in terms of the sort of issue of SMEs, again, particularly, I would say it might be sort of directed at you, Nick, but also Katie may have a view. How do we ensure that SMEs, the playing field is levelled to allow SMEs to get involved, both in terms of a framework level, but also on generally on public procurement contracts? So, how do you work to ensure that SMEs do have an equal opportunity?
So again, for me, Andrew, I'm sorry. Katie, do you want to
you go from the practical point of view, Nick, first.
Okay, thanks. So for me, I think it's important to recognise that, again, capacity in terms of bidding for public procurement and construction opportunities might not necessarily be there with SMEs. Again, they're not employing teams of bid writers to lead on this on their behalf. They're doing it from their perspective in terms of how they will intend to actually deliver. So the changes that we've made specifically is to look at that process, to look at how we evaluate and how we structure, to just try and level the playing field in terms of some of the detail. So ultimately, for me, I'm trying to get an understanding from bidders and from the supply chain as to what they could do, if they've done it well before, and how they've done it well, and how they can do it well for our members moving forward. And you don't need those 5,000 word essay type responses to understand that. And if we can make public procurement a bit more evidence based, so we're stripping back some of the detail and making sure it's simply around that delivery and how we can ensure that there will be successful delivery, that creates a bit more opportunity, because it's reducing the overall resource burden that exists on suppliers and on those SMEs, as well as how we assess the early stages in terms of some of the pass-fail criteria you would expect to see around some financial standing, around health and safety, around insurances. by adopting the use of construction line and trying to streamline that part of the process, again, it's aiming to reduce that ultimate burden that can be there for the SMEs and hopefully creating more competition for them.
Okay, Katie?
From a legal perspective, so I don't think many people use the small lot exemption enough. The regulations, you can set aside a certain amount of an overall procurement process for SMEs. And at the start of the procurement, you declare that. You say this lot will not be going out as part of the original procurement, but we're going to set it aside and tender it separately, so you can have slightly different thresholds for the SMEs. You can then still have a competitive process, but reserve that part of the overall procurement for SMEs. So the small lot exemption can be used much more than it currently is. And as you say, the idea of engaging with the market, so understanding that if you ask onerous obligations in terms of providing security such as bonds, guarantees, certain insurance levels, asking for minimum turnover, I mean, it's obviously basic points that most procurement professionals understand, but those are going to be discriminatory to an SME market if you're asking for those additions. So looking at how you can incorporate, within the procurement structure, certain lots that have lower thresholds, don't have minimum turnover requirements, but still have a proper and valid evaluation process, as well as the lots that maybe are more directed at larger players in the marketplace.
Okay, we have a comment from Paul Foster. I think Paul's at the Savini group, and it's more of a comment, but the panelists are welcome to comment afterwards. And I think that what Paul is saying that from Savini's perspective, by working closely with suppliers and contractors up front, that helps to build and create a more robust specification. So that, again, the thing you talked about, Nick, in terms of early market engagement and working closely with potential suppliers helps to actually improve the procurement process, because you're getting better outcomes through a more robust specification.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with Paul on that. And to, I guess, reiterate what we've already said around the importance of having that up front. But I guess if the alternative, if that wasn't done, is that potentially there's an opportunity to create a specification that isn't reflective of the market. It's not reflective of what the supply market can actually deliver. That would then have a knock-on effect in terms of level of interest and appetite to commit to that procurement, and also not really understanding their capabilities and potential innovations to deliver through that contract. So I would wholeheartedly agree.
Just sort of finally on this, and again, I alluded to it at the beginning, we've clearly had the challenges of Hackett and as a result from Grenfell. As far as SMEs and the coronavirus in particular is gone, clearly it's going to have a massive impact across the whole economy. But is there any way that through procurement we can perhaps protect SMEs at this particular time? I mean, do you think, I don't know, there might be some relaxation in public sector procurement rules, albeit temporarily, to allow that to happen?
That's a really good point, Andrew, and we haven't obviously seen that. There have been other relaxations in terms of business rates and other sort of tax elements, so to allow small businesses to carry on going in this current climate. I think, yeah, I mean, everyone's going to be taking a sensible approach. If you have a need now and you're a public sector body and you need it to be delivered, how are you going to structure your procurement process today? In the view that one, going to take possibly, it's going to be more difficult for teams to respond because they don't have a full complement of staff to respond to tenders. Again, how they're going to resource the actual contract when it needs to be delivered. So for those who have urgent need for services or for supplies that they are about to push a button on procurement, yes, I think it would be very sensible for the contracting authorities to really take a good look at what they're asking for, and maybe then tempering down the requirements so they actually know that they will get a response. They've obviously gone through some quality and price and some competitive element that they need to comply with the regulations, but they are not asking the earth, they're not asking for a gold-plated tender response to come back. Actually give the market some slack to be able to respond and deliver those requirements. There are, again, regulations, ability to go negotiate directly with suppliers, and that is, in events of extreme urgency. It is extreme urgency. Whether if you had a procurement need now, and because of coronavirus, potentially if you want to build a new hospital, for example, then I expect you could probably invoke that and negotiate with the contractor you want to deliver that directly, and that would be covered under the extreme urgency requirement. But equally, then that may, as the weeks go on, become more and more used to be able to do direct negotiation with the marketplace to deliver what you need, because actually it is now an emergency situation.
Okay.
Yeah, just to add to that, Andrew, I think it's a good point. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and obviously these are very challenging times, unprecedented, and there will still need to be works and services that are delivered. How the regulations are used to deliver some imminent works if there's no capacity within existing supply chains. Again, I think we would have to err on the side of caution in terms of still ensuring that value for money is delivered. But I think there is a real opportunity for us, for our members and the supply chain to actually work together to see where the pinch points are, to see where the key risk areas are, to see where the fundamental requirements are, and then to work together to see how those can be delivered.
Yeah. Okay.
The other point to mention on that is that there will need to be, we need to talk to each other. If you're delivering essential services to people, and I was thinking this morning about our many repairs and maintenance contracts that we help our clients to procure, that is a difficult situation to be in, where you are going into people's houses and presumably there are certain requirements and processes which we need to follow, but it may well be that for those types of contracts you are looking at making sure that you can sorry, that's not me either, but that you can actually make sure that you are looking at negotiating variations to those contracts for a temporary period to ensure that those repairs and maintenances can be carried out in the current environment, and maybe imposing different requirements on contractors who are going into people's homes. So we can't, as I'm sure many of you are thinking of, well, we can't shut down the help that we give the people who are vulnerable, because they still need to have things, they still need to have heating repaired, they still need to have things fixed within their homes, or those homes are going to become unlivable uninhabitable, even if, and if they're poorly as well at the same time, we are, really setting ourselves up for a real problem. So that was an awful fear that I'm sure many of you are having to deal with at the moment on the ground.
Yeah, from our Fusion21 perspective, I know that we've done some engagement with our supply chain around some of the early coronavirus challenges, and one example of that was one of our gas servicing contractors commented that one of their engineers had visited a member's property. They were let in by the son, and then walked into the kitchen, and father was there, and then informed him informed the engineer that he was self-isolating. And again, I think the lesson is, the encouragement of messages out to tenants and residents to say, if you are self-isolating, can you please tell us as the landlord, so that we can tell our supply chain to alert them in terms of those particular circumstances. So yeah, I'm sure that over this next period of time there will be other examples, and again, from a Fusion21 perspective, we're happy to sort of collate on behalf of members any evidence of good practice or issues, so as that we can speak to and pass those on to our suppliers and also to our members. Okay, so moving on, again, for me, one of the real sort of, I think, shames on the sector was the fact that over the last number of years, we haven't involved residents enough. And again, that's a clear recommendation from stage 1 of the Grenfell inquiry, and the need to ensure that there is a tenant voice. And whilst in some respects in procurement, the involvement of residents may actually only be limited to section 20. I just wonder in terms of, that, how the panel think and believe residents should be more involved in the procurement process, and advice to members about how that can be improved.
So I think from the legal point of view, and I think that there was certainly a real sort of trend towards including residents in procurement strategies until such point as there were potential challenges about the capability of evaluation panels. And I think that then put a number of public sector bodies off including residents on the basis that they could be criticised from allowing residents to give a view on elements of the service that they were not expert in. So I think we did see that for a long time, certainly with organisations that sadly, of course, come under massive scrutiny as a result of Grenfell Towers tenant management organisation. But of course, then they were people pulled back for including residents, and now we're obviously being encouraged back to include them in the procurement process. Legally, it's absolutely fine to include residents at any stage of the procurement process, provided you're very clear about what their role is and what they are evaluating. So, and their expertise is around delivery of services in their homes and delivery of work to their properties. So that's exactly the sort of feedback and input you need to get from them, not potentially because they happen to be a QS by trade, get their views on the cost evaluation. I think that is a dangerous territory to go into. So certainly if you're going to be strict about your evaluation panel, everyone has an area of expertise and they stick to that. Of course, they might want to discuss their overall views on tender proposals, but if they can make sure it's very clear what their role is and what their expertise is, then it's absolutely great to involve residents. Another area where I think, again, it was encouraged originally to get out on site visits and include residents on interviews. It's still fine to do that, but it's important to know what the role of those interviews, the role of those site visits is, and again, the input that residents give on the ground about the current contractors that are working there. Their feedback on them has to be taken in the context of what they've been asked, again, because otherwise it can place a sort of unfair skewing on an evaluation process, which is why, again, lawyers are quite reluctant to say, site visits are great and interviews are great, because it does provide that subjective element, which is harder to defend in the event of a challenge. So absolutely provide the rules of engagement clearly for the role of the residents on the evaluation panel, but don't, and the same for any other expert on that panel, don't let them give views on areas that they are not technically expert in.
And just on that point, Katie, are there any areas that are sort of less contentious, or if you were advising a Fusion21 member, that you would say, well, yes, this particular procurement is right for involving residents, but perhaps if you're another form of procurement exercise, not to involve them, or is that a bit simplistic?
I think anything now, if we're going to follow the Hackett guidance, where you are undertaking work to residents' properties, then you really do need to involve them. The transparency, the understanding of the health and safety evaluation, it is really important for them to be aware of. You're right, that obviously services that many public sectors, are going to procure in terms of financial services or IT services, that may not have a direct impact per se on their customers, but then arguably everything does have a direct impact. But there may be some things that much more sort of central office functions that you wouldn't get residents involved in, but elements that are going to have directly impact on where they live, even grounds maintenance, landscaping, where they live, the area surrounding them, the services being delivered to them. I think it's fair, following the recommendation, to involve them in all aspects of those processes.
Okay, Nick.
Yeah, I appreciate some of the challenges that may exist in involving residents within the evaluation process, but still there is a role to play for residents within that. I do think that there is a greater level of importance on the residents actually being involved in the first piece of work in terms of designing those asset strategies, and we've covered in quite a bit of depth the importance of suppliers being involved in shaping procurement strategies, and for me the same principles do apply to how residents are involved in that, and their input into asset strategies would be key to making sure that those plans reflect their needs. They could do that by inputting on how work is actually staged or structured or delivered, asking them for ideas on innovative methods of delivering work and the types of technologies potentially that could be used within properties, which ultimately could improve the quality of life for them as well as delivering the aims of the landlord at the same time. So early engagement, absolutely critical to doing that, and creating opportunities for engagement might exist in terms of workshops. There might be meet the buyer type events, but then having a structure to actually having a structure and the time to take that feedback back and really think about how that can affect both the asset and the procurement strategies. And again, any time of how the procurement process is managed is crucial to that, to making sure that can be delivered. But if it is delivered, then it could potentially lead to more ownership from residents in the delivery of work, as well as improving overall resident satisfaction as well.
I know lots of housing organisations are currently sort of revising their, what I think is now commonly called their tenant or resident voice strategies, but quite often that work is led by perhaps resident involvement teams. Do you see there advantage of those resident involvement teams working together with procurement teams to ensure that at least the resident voice is heard, even if they're not directly involved in, say, for example, the evaluation process?
Yeah, I personally think so. I think that certainly from the very outset, and again, thinking about that initial strategy piece, if there are groups that are set up to cover the residents' voice, I think that should be fed back into both asset and procurement strategies, and there should be a connection there between the two groups. I think for me it's important at the start of any procurement process, strategy development, that nothing should really be off the table in terms of ideas and the potential to deliver that particular contract, and involving residents and giving them a voice within that, whilst sort of managing their expectations within it, should certainly be a key part of it.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the issue is that balancing of the input of residents and the concern that if you include them, they'll obviously want the best possible solution, but obviously there are cost implications of that, and I think the engagement and the understanding of those groups about what budgets are, what can be spent on properties, what needs to be spent on properties, what are the health and safety requirements, all that transparency, I think and certainly that my experience is that produces a better procurement outcome, and certainly happier and more satisfied residents if they've understood why decisions are being made. The problem is, unfortunately, there is not, a never-ending budget, is there? So actually, there are going to be some hard decisions made about what work can be undertaken to certain properties in the asset management strategy, what investment can be carried out, the impact of, fire safety regulations, what, recommendations there are in terms of making buildings safe, and the budgets available to do that. So it is a very difficult balancing line to have, which is, including residents is part of that early engagement, but making sure that obviously they understand the constraints that the public sector are under.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, just finally on that, again, for our members benefit. Fusion are currently just about to embark on some work with TPAS around producing a good practice guide of involving residents in procurement. And again, an ask from us over the coming weeks will be very much to for our members to start to share with us that good practice around resident involvement and what they're currently doing. So moving on to the final question of this morning's session. How do procurement teams respond to the zero carbon agenda? Clearly, whether or not it's the result of Greta Thunberg or Blue Planet or whatever, clearly we are all now committed to saving the planet, and zero carbon is going to form a real part of how we address that moving forward. And in particular, how do procurement teams respond? Nick, do you want to go first?
Sure. So procurement strategies generally should always consider government policy, and I always feel that we've got quite a big responsibility actually as procurement professionals to support the delivery of government policy and support the delivery of the government agenda through public spend, and whether that's having a positive social impact through procurement to delivering the SME targets, and now to supporting delivery of zero carbon. And 2050 seems like a long way away, and to be honest, I hope it is, because I'll be 65 by that point, and I certainly don't want that to happen anytime soon. But the opportunity for us within this is to start supporting the delivery of the agenda now. And frameworks are generally in place for 4 years, but that's not about us then saying, well, we've got another 8 generation frameworks before we get to 2050 or before we need to worry about it. There will undoubtedly be a transition, and it will be a step change in how we approach zero carbon. As an example, we recently went live with our new heating and renewables framework, and through that framework and through the early engagement activity that we had with our supply chain, we actually created a bespoke supply chain to deliver renewable only works, as well as allowing the delivery of renewable technologies alongside some of the more traditional heating systems as well. So that was positive for us. We're starting to see some of the changes through that in terms of increasing the delivery of the renewable technologies, but it was critical for us within our procurement strategy to make sure that our framework had the flexibility to deliver both options, i.e., bespoke renewable supply chains, but also the flexibility through existing more traditional heating systems as well. And I'm not sure we would have got to that point if we didn't have a strong approach in terms of that early engagement activity with the supply chain and with our members as well. So in general, for us, responding to the zero carbon agenda, Fusion21 is about being in touch with what is happening at government level and thinking about how we can actually influence that through procurement, and then having the flexibility to deliver and actually thinking about how our current frameworks now and our contracts now can provide a platform for future change.
I mean, I know, for example, that there are measures to, for example, measure social value. I mean, do you now see a position where we'll be measuring carbon reduction as part of the procurement process, or asking in terms of evaluation questions? How much will you be able to result in that carbon reduction strategy, but specifically as part of the procurement process?
I mean, I'm going to button on that one, sorry, Nick, but I was just going to say, that really is, that really does link into the Hackett recommendations in, balancing the upfront cost against the sort of overall quality, effectiveness and efficiency. And so there are, again, under the regulations, ability there to assess on the basis of life cycle costing. That is perfectly acceptable to do. Where I think I said earlier is the missing link, isn't it? Is the data around being able to understand what this is going to cost upfront, this particular product, this particular heating system, and understanding that the guarantee that this will reduce carbon, will be more energy efficient, isn't linked to a leap of faith. I think we've got to go there in order to be able to go with the zero carbon agenda and invest in these technologies that can prove, but haven't managed to prove for the last 20 or 30 or even 50 years that they do provide a better energy efficient solution. But it does look like they are going to. I mean, this is the risk. That's why we all revert back to traditional, and why certainly things like it in the modular manufacturing business, they're struggling to get through the barrier of innovation and new products coming on that the public sector will not take the risk of, because they haven't been backed up by years of research confirming that they do deliver what they're saying they deliver. So I think you can evaluate and assess on that basis, but there is definitely, in order to make the zero carbon agenda, a leap of faith that needs to happen within the public sector to take a risk on some of these products that are coming forward. I don't know, we can't square that off with a procurement solution necessarily. It is got to be, from the top down, to take forward some of these innovative products and hope that they are going to, produce the results we want.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that looking at some what we discussed earlier around some of the changes we made to our procurement process to create more opportunities across supply chains and for SMEs is, if we're looking at what can be done, what suppliers have done before, and whether they've done it well, if there is a focus around an evidence-based approach within that evaluation process, I get Katie's point that looking to the future, there will, to an extent, be a leap of faith and some trust put within the suppliers that they will deliver what they're saying they can deliver, but also understanding their experience and what potentially they've done before to back some of that up will be a way potentially to mitigate that.
Okay. Well, we've reached the end of the set agenda, and in terms of one last chance for anybody in the audience to ask any further questions. But one thing, whilst I'm just waiting to see if there are any further questions, but one thing from me. So for Katie and Nick, is there something that you think will be the lasting legacy from Hackett in terms of what will really be the sort of positive outcomes as far as procurement is concerned from those events in that report?
That's a big one to finish on, Andrew. So I mean, I think that there is a missed opportunity that we haven't had the guidance out in the Building a Safer Future legislation on procurement as much as we'd hoped for. But the legacy will be about safety and quality, and that will be built into the procurement process, so that it would be, almost negligent to go out to the market and not ask questions about the quality of the products that the supply chain are providing, knowing where they're coming from, making sure that they are, have a kite mark that, and also asking questions about safety processes on and off site. This would, we cannot now go out to the market without asking and interrogating those questions and checking that the market can deliver, that the contractors and suppliers and service providers we engage on public sector projects are building safe and are building with a quality agenda, which is going to cost the public purse more, because you're going to need to make sure you pay for that uplift in quality and that uplift in building safety.
Yeah, and for me, it's good to finish on a positive, is that there are perhaps three key areas that I see in terms of positives on the back of Hackett and the recommendations when they're implemented, is that, as Katie says, there'll be better quality or safer work being delivered. I think it creates an opportunity, secondly, for better engagement across supply chains, which is undoubtedly a positive. And then finally, there will hopefully be a focus on skill development and expertise across procurement professionals to actually go and deliver that. So for me, probably focusing it on those three key areas. And
we have one sort of final comment from Peter Francis in terms of, again, in your experiences, are organisations looking to learn lessons from Hackett, and will this sector genuinely stop the chasing the bottom line. Again, if you've got any views on that, panel.
I'd love to see that, but I think as consultants, we need to be stronger, don't we, Nick? I mean, it's the same. We need to say to clients, you do understand what you're doing if you put this as a percentage, quality at this level and price at this level. So there is a need for a lead from anybody advising the public sector to emphasise what that will result in. I know it's blindingly obvious to most people, but sometimes still we see a lot of procurement weighted 80% price, 20% quality, and it's really hard. It's the consultant's job to advise that this may not be the right solution for them.
Yeah, and again, I guess part of the challenge is appreciating that there is across the public sector still a pressure in terms of cost, and there isn't an endless pot of money to go and deliver works. But having said that, I think to follow some of the best practices in terms of what we've discussed in depth around market engagement, supplier engagement, member engagement, the resident engagement, to define some of those strategies, hopefully that would have a positive influence in terms of the general approach to procurement. That's certainly what we're doing at Fusion21, and I'm sure it's happening with others across our member base as well. So I would hope to see some positive change and in light of the challenges in terms of austerity.
Okay, that's a great note to finish on. I want to thank Katie Saunders, Trowers and Hamlins, and Nick Verburg, Fusion21, for being our panel today. I want to thank you as the audience for listening. Hopefully you found it informative. We will be in touch. As I said at the beginning, this is the first time we've run a session in this way. It may be, taking the words of Peter Kay, a bit like garlic bread. It may well be the future, who knows. But let's get your feedback, and again, thank you very much. Big virtual round of applause from me and the audience for our panel. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Thank you, Andrew.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.